Tēnā koutou. My name is Nicola Daly. I'm from the University of Waikato in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I'll be in conversation with my friend and colleague Witi Ihimaera, one of our most celebrated New Zealand authors. Tēnā koe, Witi.
Kia ora, Nicola.
I see us as collaborators in terms of increasing awareness of te ao Māori and te reo Māori, but your career has much deeper roots than mine. You were the first Māori novelist in New Zealand when you published Tangi in 1972, and this year you're celebrating its 50th anniversary as a writer with a newly rewritten anniversary edition.
I'm older than I look.
It's customary for us from Aotearoa, New Zealand to begin with what we call a mihi, or a greeting, so I'm going to ask you, Witi, to do this on our behalf.
Okay. Well, in Māoridom, we say that you have to stand to talk. And we also say that if you don't stand, or if you stand, then you will live. If you lie down, you will die. So if you will permit me to stand, and then I won't die. Whakarongo ake au ki te tangi a te manu nei, a te matui tui a. Tui e rongo, tui e raro, tui e roto, tui e waho. Tui te here tangata, ka rongo te ao, ka rongo te pō. Tui te kāwai tangata I heke mai Hawaii ki nui, Hawaii ki roa, Hawaii ki pāmamao. Ki te hono I wairua, ki te pāiao, ki te ao mārama, ti hei Māori ora. Kei te tūake a hau ki te mihi ki a koutou, ngā salish, iwi, tēnā koutou, ka nui te honore ko homai a kia māua ki te koutou. E noho I tō whenua, nā reira, tēnā koutou. Koutou katoa, my new friends from the Congress, thank you for coming. I have been so honoured and humbled to be here, and I'm so thankful to Sarah for the invitation to come from Aotearoa, New Zealand, with Nicola. Nā reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Well, you know, Nicola, it was really interesting because I wrote this book, the book that Whale Rider was based on, in 1986. And then the movie came out in 2002. And this time around, you know, I'd forgotten that it was so much about the magic child. And that it was also about life, death, and destiny. And I had also forgotten that when I wrote it, Māoridom was changing from a traditional culture into one that had to be super fast and super active in attempting to become and achieve equity, excellence, and judicial justice for Māori in New Zealand. So, but I also thought, seeing the old man up there and seeing how he felt about his granddaughter, I'd forgotten that my own grandfather was like that. And my father had been the eldest son of an 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 eldest son, going all the way back to the beginning of time. And then when I had a daughter, Jessica Kitty, his response was, well, you try again. The next time you will have a son. And of course I did try again, and I had another daughter, Olivia Ata. So the film and the book in particular was my attempt to have him love me. The book was to show him that times were changing, that it was important now for Māori to go ahead with more leaders, and that gender should not matter.
Yes, I was thinking a lot about Maya's talk earlier today and about the boxes of gender and how this film kind of challenges those boxes. And I was just, as the film started, I leant over to Witi and said, I feel like I'm going home. It feels like home when I watch that movie. You've done the most amazing thing. You've given us all this huge taonga, and as we've been meeting people prior to this evening, several people have said to us, well, I watch that movie repeatedly, quite often. It's a touchstone for me. It's something that I go back to. And I
Yes,
don't know, did you realise?
One of the ironies, Nicola, was that although you and I come from New Zealand, I actually wrote it in New York. And so it's kind of like one of those books that sometimes we write when we are overseas and we are, I guess, it's almost like a book that was written as if I had been banished. And so a book out of banishment. And I think that because I was so far away, that gave me enough distance to be able to write the book. I think with as much honesty, but also with as much emotion as you can obtain when you are living in alienation like that.
Why were you in New York, Witi?
I was like the father of Pai in that movie, and had decided that one of the ways in which I could obtain my grandfather's devotion was to be as international as I possibly could be. So I became a diplomat for the New Zealand service, and I was a diplomat for 16 years, serving in New York and then also in Washington, D.C. And I had started my job as a diplomat in Australia, at Canberra. I don't think that he loved me anymore because I had proven that Māori could do anything and go anywhere. But I think that, and he never ever said anything to me about, about having broken through that glass ceiling of what we can achieve. But anyway, I didn't do it for him. I did it for myself, and I did it to show that it doesn't matter who you are, that you can do anything and you can achieve what your dreams, what you aspire to. And all my life, I've often wondered, is my life according to the dictates of fiction quite by accident, or am I really writing my life to be that fiction? And I think that that's what I'm doing, the latter rather than the former.
Writing your life to be that fiction.
Yes. Yes.
Was there a specific happening that led to the writing of the book?
Because I'm a Māori writer and an Indigenous writer, I've always felt that the only way that I can authenticate my work is to make sure that it has a Māori or Indigenous urtext or original text. And so I use the urtext or original text to connect my work to the pito or umbilical of the mythical text. If I don't do that, I might borrow or I might put my umbilical into a European story or a European source. So I try to make sure that my umbilical is firmly implanted in the uterus of my storytelling, not anybody else's. And in the case of The Whale Rider, that uterus or womb is the ocean that we actually share with Santa Barbara, the Pacific. Well, you on the northeast coast here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is way down there in the southwest, and then of course right in the middle is the Polynesian Triangle with Hawaii at the apex. So this particular story, The Whale Rider, is a very Polynesian story. It's set within the Polynesian Triangle between Hawaii, Easter Island and Aotearoa. And that in fact maps out the geography, the ecological geography of all of my work. It all exists within this triangle.
Right.
A good shape to write on.
As we've been preparing for this conversation, I've learned a lot from you, Witi, and a lot of people here won't know that the Māori of Aotearoa are actually the youngest of all the populations that came out of Tanzania,
Yes.
Africa, from an original Eve. Over time, those original populations spread throughout the continent into Europe, across to North America, and westward into Asia. And genetic scientists have traced the ancestors of Māori as arriving in Taiwan and populating the South Pacific, arriving eventually in our islands in Aotearoa.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing for me to even think about all of our migrations around the world and where we fit within those sequences. And certainly, to me, it's always a proud moment to know that I'm among the youngest of the world's populations, and therefore I can make as many mistakes as I can as the youngest child. And you are all my elders here. You know, you're the eldest. You come from the eldest civilizations. Whereas mine is like that little boy who's being cradled by his father over there. The Portuguese. So there was this original Eve, and she was in Tanzania. And over time, those original populations spread throughout the continent into Europe, across to North America, or westward into Asia. I'm sure you know all of this. And genetic scientists did trace us from coming here. They came to New Zealand on large seagoing canoes. So I was really pleased, at lunch today when we met an indigenous voyager who was telling me about the waka that you have here in the Salish people.
Is that right? Yeah. The tomo, yeah.
Yes, yes. And, I have to say that I'm grateful that how grateful I am to Sarah Pankania World for organising the lunch with you, Mia. Because one of the most profound things is to be able to meet people everywhere you go. But in particular, Mia brought along her family, and that was herself, her mother, her son, and her grandson. So I was able to meet 4 generations at one lunchtime. And it's that kind of vertical understanding that you get, which fills you with joy. And I've had so much of that vertical understanding here at this conference.
Mm-hmm. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about Paikea?
Yes, so in the movie, what happens when you make a movie is that you really only have around about 90 to 100 minutes. Originating story of Paikea is not in the movie. So therefore, although at the conference we have been looking at the ecologies of childhood and also the place of nature and the place of the environment in it, that kind of story of the womb of the Polynesian people isn't on the film, but it's certainly in the book. And so we have a very, very strong relationship with cetaceans. And when the whales returned on their annual migrations to their feeding grounds in the Antarctica from the original homeland of the Māori, which was in French Polynesia near Tahiti, what our waka used to do was to embed themselves in the pods of whales. They would embed themselves in the pods of whales and follow the whale pathways in the ocean to our country. And when you think about it, isn't that astounding that we would use whales to be able to find Aotearoa? Because those whales were on their migration down to Antarctica. They would go past the eastern seaboard of New Zealand on their way there. And so the canoes would then leave the whale pods and then head towards land. And among the Voyager stories is one of my own tribal origin about a young warrior prince. And so this is not in the movie, but it's the context of the movie. And his name was Paikea. He lived in French Polynesia in the region of Tahiti. And he actually rode the whale to escape from a half-brother who wanted to kill him and take the throne. So it is the prince story here is coming into play. And it's about the half-blood prince against the full-blood prince. So his brother wanted to kill him and take the throne, but his pet whale rescued him, and then his half-brother pursued him in a rather epic sea battle for 10 or so days southward to New Zealand, where Paikea finally escaped by coming to shore at a place called Whangārā. And that place, Whangārā, is what you see now on the screen.
So the movie was actually filmed in Whangārā, and the whare nui, the building with the whale rider on top is a real whare nui, isn't it?
Yes, ever since I began filmmaking, I've realised that a sense of place, especially of a real place, is so important in establishing the world of the film. And I was just so amazed, I used to love going out to Whangārā. It's around about 5 hours bike ride to get out there. When I was a young boy, I would go out there just to look at that meeting house. Yes. And then I'd ask my ancestor on his whale on the top there, how did you breathe when the whale sounded? I was such an imaginative child, and I wanted it to be real, and I wanted to make sure that it was real, and I wanted to believe so much that this could happen, and I knew it could happen. So therefore I used to go to the local swimming pool, dive in, and then I would have a watch on my, and this is when I was about 12, and I have a watch on my hand, and I'd start looking at the watch and think, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and then I'd be forced to come up and I'd think, not good enough, Witi.
So you really were always fascinated by this story, weren't you?
I've always been fascinated by story, and what's been amazing about this conference is the synchronicity of all of our stories. There have been stories of recovery, for instance. You know, I was in a session this afternoon and was astounded to learn of women scientists who lived in the 18th century who were writing books. I thought that to me was the recovery of a history of women against all odds, because that must have been a very patriarchal time for women to be even thinking of writing. And it's been fantastic for me to even talk to other people about their work. It's just been so amazing. So when I was young, around about 10, and I was a farmer's son, so we lived on a farm with no electric lights and with no television, and when the sun went down, we went to bed. When the sun came up, we woke up and went to work. And my father, Tom, was the farmer, a sheep shearer, and I started to write on the walls of my bedroom with a pencil. And I would write the stories that I heard down at the marae, including this one of the whale rider. Or I would write about Tāwhaki, who is the only man in our entire human history to make a journey into space way before NASA did. He didn't go on a spaceship, though. He climbed on a kumara vine. And so, these are sweet potato vines. So these were the stories that, I grew up with. And they were always embedded with this idea that we came from a culture that valued story. In fact, I used to think that we were not storytellers, but we were story singers or story dancers, and that our way of evoking stories was much more physical than European storytelling. Mm. Yeah.
I think you told me that that your mother, when you left, your mother painted your bedroom walls yellow, sort of painted over all the stories you'd written on the walls. Is that right?
Yes, when I left school to go to college and then university, because my grandmother, whom I loved very much, and Jorge talked about his grandmother and grandmothers today. Well, I was brought up by all of these grandmothers, and they still sit in my skull, and they still whisper in my ear about what I'm doing right and what I'm doing wrong. And when I was in Washington, D.C., and I was coming home, I decided to go and see a psychic. And this psychic, after having sat me down for, it seemed like 25 or 30 minutes, told me that he couldn't do anything for me because there was a woman, she was standing in a shaft of blinding light, and she would not let him pass. And as soon as he said that, I knew it was Teria, my grandmother, and that she would always guard me, safeguard me, until the end of my time here on Earth.
Wonderful to have such a guardian. Now, you've already mentioned that you were living in New York when you started writing this story. Is it right that you saw a whale in the Hudson River and then you started writing the novel?
Well, I was always trying to transcend my limitations as a person, because I was such a bad student. It took me 9 years to get a very bad Bachelor of Arts degree. My father, Tom, sent me a telegram which said, "Congratulations, stop. About time, stop." Even the tortoise didn't take this long, stop. However, I managed to fool my government into sending me to America, and I was living on the 33rd floor of an apartment building on West 67th Street. And it was a very, very sunny day, and all of a sudden these helicopters came whizzing down the Hudson River, and when I looked out, a whale was spouting in the distance.
So how did you interpret that?
Well, you know, it made me cry. I thought it had come from the Pacific to say hello. And, you know, the Hudson River at that time was really black and dirty. What whale would ever want to swim into it? And then the most important thing, my two daughters, Jessica and Olivia, came on vacation. And we went to a number of movies, and Jessica, who was 11, complained to me, why was it that it was always the boys who got to ride the spaceships and save the galaxy? Why not the girls as well? So I put the whale and my daughter's arrival together and decided to write a contemporary story of a modern-day paikea, except that she was now a girl. When my paikea rides the whale, she becomes Moby Chick. And all of my friends in New York, all of my Brooklyn friends especially, they all reckon that she's a New York gal, a Brooklyn gal. So she does indeed save the universe. In her case, she becomes the leader of her tribe when only boys were allowed to do that. And what is wonderful to me is that I was able to start a new origin story. I was able to start a new origin story for a traditional patriarchal tribal nation, just as Paikea had, the original ancestor, a new whale rider for a new generation.
Mm. And when the book was first published, what was the response you got for I'm thinking first of all about tribes around Aotearoa. Some tribes have only male leaders, some tribes have female and male leaders. What kind of responses? Did you get any responses?
Well, maybe I can say that first of all, I was a Māori writer, and so the Pākehā or European response, there was none. I think I was still invisible in those days. And then, of course, because I was breaking some taboos, or tapu, we call it, in my own culture, you know, the girl is fighting with a maurako. She is someone who is learning all of these chants that were normally the realm of tohunga, or of priests. She then decides, to take that destiny into her own hands. And there was actually quite a lot of disapproval, from some tribal elders about the whole idea of a woman at the end, as you saw, helming or captaining the waka. But I've always tried to push boundaries and to make the world a better place and to make sure that it is inclusive. And I think that's why I was put here on this earth to try to create new stories for new generations, for the next generation. So also there was no internet, no social networks, no Google, no Facebook, no Snapchat, no Instagram that would have spread the word. So I'm very proud of a product that has made its way without any help, without any support into the world, and I thank you for coming.
As well as the text or the ancient text that you mentioned, we also have to be aware of the context or the history of the world surrounding Māori at the time, don't we? That despite yes. Māori chiefs signing a treaty with the new settler government and the British Crown in 1840, it was soon broken.
Well, did you know that there was one moment in New Zealand's history when there were more British soldiers in New Zealand than any other place in the world, even more than were in Canada. And so there was a huge uprising, Māori uprising, in the 1840s to 1880s. And Pākehā called it the New Zealand Wars and the Māori Wars, but Māori called them the Pākehā Wars. So they were actually a series of wars that by attrition, by death and disease, our population went from 100% to 10% with wholesale land confiscation. And by the time I was born in the 1940s, we were just beginning to achieve the turnaround in our fortunes. And as you know, in New Zealand, there was a time when anthropologists would say, well, there is nothing more that we can do for Māori except to smooth the pillow for their coffin. So it was that drastic for us, just as it has been as drastic for some of the indigenous people in this country. However, around about the 1970s, we saw times of increasing sovereignty. And so I'm part of that, because my first novel came out in 1972. And that is the one that I'm celebrating my 50th year as a novelist. It's incredible to think that there had not been any novels beforehand, but that is the truth. So it's a marvellous story of resilience and determination, and then there was me writing away. But here's the thing, Mia. Although the land, Māori language and culture had been taken away, it still remained in the memory. It still remained in the memory, such as in all of those texts, those pūrākau, those mythologies. And I was so moved to hear you talk about the villages that you still can name in all of your oral traditions, the geographies that you were able to continue to tell to this world. So while other Māori took up direct political action to ensure stronger political representation, I took it upon myself to write those memories down as stories. I took it upon myself it was the best offer to everyone about how I personally could assist retain possession of our primary asset, because when everything else is gone, all you have is memory and story.
Mm-hmm. Yes. What fascinated me about The Whale Rider is that it doesn't go into grievance mode, but it moves forward into the future by showing how a new generation can reclaim cultural inheritance, including the old way of connecting the human world with the natural world.
Well, you're Pākehā, and I'm Māori, so I managed to create an audience among the majority of Pākehā in New Zealand, because they began to believe around about the 1980s and 90s that the future of Aotearoa New Zealand was in acknowledging two knowledges. At the time, they only acknowledged one knowledge, and that was the knowledge that came from the Westminster tradition. And I've mentioned before that Māori have that saying, tama tū, tama ora, tama noho, tama mate. If you stand, you live. If you lie down, you die. And we've always taken the long view. We've always taken the long view on survival. And aha ko he iti te moko koa I ka kata te kahikatea. We always say that although it's small, even the caterpillar, by gnawing patiently away, can bring down the white pine tree.
You've told us a little bit about the origin of writing The Whale Rider and where you were. Could you tell us a little bit more about perhaps how long it took and the structure of it?
Well, the book actually took me 3 weeks to write, the first draft. 3 weeks. And that is because I was engaged. I was totally engaged. I would go to work in the morning, I would write in lunchtime, I would go back to work in the afternoon, I would go back to the apartment in the evening. The Big Apple, poor Big Apple, had to do without me for those 3 weeks when I just wrote. I structured the book according to what I call the Indigenous storytelling framework, and that is summer, autumn, winter, and the book ends in the radiance of spring or in renewal. So all of my books are like that. They end always on this uplift, on renewal. I wouldn't say it's optimism or hope, but certainly on renewal itself. And I decided I would make it as much of a Pacific object as possible by setting parts of it in Tierra del Fuego, in Chile, Easter Island, Raiatea in French Polynesia, Papua New Guinea and Australia. So it's a very, very Pacific-wide book, because I wanted it to be a Pacific story, not just a Māori story. And that, I think, is why it appealed to the filmmakers. And
the environmental message carried within this pūrākau, this story, this Pakiwai Tarapip maybe, was very fashion-forward for the time. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, this is really interesting, because when I got to New York, I became very aware of the nuclear danger facing the globe, because on the day that I arrived, the Chernobyl disaster happened. And a cloud of radioactive dust was rumoured to be coming down the Atlantic seaboard. And at the same time, nations were meeting on a nuclear-free Pacific and the need to ban further whaling slaughter. And of course my New York girlfriends, once they knew the main character was a girl, would keep on encouraging me to give her more feminist personality and sass and make her a street smart as they were. So I kept grabbing incidents out of the air and putting them in the book, like the empty chair that Kahu faces when she gives her speech at the school prize giving. I still think that that's one of the most heartbreaking moments that could happen in the movie. And it happened to me when I was going to school, and my grandfather was supposed to come, but he didn't arrive. And so I grabbed that incident from my own life and put it there. The one great wrestle that I had with myself as an artist was that in the original draft, I had written a chapter in which Nanny Flowers dies. And so Kahu has to face her grandfather's ongoing paranoia without her grandmother's support. And that would have been a different story and a less hopeful situation for her. Like we were talking within our Congress about the need for us to maintain hope for children. But there is also the reality for children that the world is not always that hopeful all the time. Well, I brought Nanny Flowers back in as I couldn't bear the thought of Kahu duking it out alone with her grandfather. And much later, I changed the ending. I mean, the book has gone through 5 different versions. And on the 3rd version, I decided to change the ending because in the novel, I had given the last words of blessing to Kahu, to the old male whale. And the old male whale is the one who says, "Child, fulfill your destiny." But I altered the character who says those words to the old female whale, an elder woman authenticating the young girl, rather than the male doing that. After all, patriarchy has always been one of my targets. He and I are old enemies. And so this change supported the matriarchy. To continue, the book became progressively successful in New Zealand by word of mouth. But it wasn't until the movie was released in 2002, 16 years later, that the book went international, and it transcended its location, its indigeneity, and its specificity to become universal. And today the book has become the most translated in New Zealand's history. And next year it will be translated into the Amharic Semitic language for an Ethiopian edition.
Wow.
Pretty good for a book, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, speaking of international, you've just come here from...
People began to joke about me being the prince,
yes.
about being the Prince of Wales.
What do your daughters say about that? Yeah. They think you might almost be as famous as the Prince of Wales. You've actually come to this conference from being the guest of the Presence Autocone Indigenous Film Festival in Montreal, haven't you?
Well, following The Whale Rider, 3 more of my books were optioned to be made into films. Nights in the Gardens of Spain, Mahana and White Lies, and so they were shown there in Montreal. And 2 other books have been optioned for future development, Sleep Standing and The Uncle Story. So I'm afraid you haven't seen the last of me yet. But it's always very hard, as most of you who are filmmakers know, to get films to the gate. Whale Rider took 12 years, and one of the reasons why it took 12 years was that a movie called Once More Warriors came out just as we were about to make Whale Rider. And we realized that we couldn't really make Whale Rider in the wake of this amazingly visceral, strong and violent movie about Māori. And so we waited for 10 years and then put it into production. I have to tell you that it was only $4 million New Zealand to make this movie, which is around about $2 million American. And at the same time, there was a bigger movie project happening in New Zealand called Lord of the Rings. So Lord of the Rings was getting all of this money from our government, and the tourist department branded New Zealand Middle Earth, and I kept on going around saying, no, this is not Middle Earth, this is Māori Earth. That still didn't get us any more money.
Coming back to Whale Rider, coming back to all of your writing and your career as a writer, What does this tell us, the readers and viewers, about you, Witi? What does your career tell us about you?
Well, I'm in the odd position in the film world of having, by next year, 6 of my work as the original story writer, as the original novelist. And then I've always believed that you should never only stand at the back of your work as the writer, you should also get in front as a producer. So I learned production skills. I learned how one sets up film productions, how you raise money, how you get involved with distribution agreements. And so it's been important for me to make sure that not only am I talking the talk, but walking the talk. So I'm tenacious, and I have stamina, and I'm also very, very opportunistic. And I take every opportunity to do work. This year, in my 50th year, I have 5 books coming out, and I've just had a play produced in New Zealand, which we're hoping to bring here to the United States in 2 years' time. And I have another play which a group of Māori, a kapahaka team, want to make into a performance show for France. I don't do that by myself. I just get into these collaborations because younger people seem to want to be involved in them. And I really am grateful to a younger generation of filmmakers, and really am grateful for a number of younger Māori people, younger people. Niki Caro, she was the young film director. She had not made a film, feature film, before she made Whale Rider. Isn't that amazing? Barry Barclay, Lee Tamahori was another one. After having made Once for Warriors, this is his second Māori film. So, yes, it's been a profound journey, and one that I wouldn't have been able to do without collaborations, which is why I've been so interested in this conference, because I keep on seeing people that I'd like to work with.
Well, I think we're coming to the end of our time for our conversation, Witi. I'm going to pass over to Emily Zinn now, who will take some questions from the floor.
I wanted to ask you, in terms of when a book goes into a film, you talked a little bit about the fact that you had a kind of a story and a context that was not in the film. What do you think the film gives us that your book didn't give you? What kind of sort of positive parts? Because often people say, "Oh, the book was so much better than the film." And I was just wondering, from the film point of view, what do you think was brought out by the film that maybe wasn't in the book?
I think that the film is an absolutely wonderful cinematic experience. The book is not a cinematic experience. The book is more informational, and it is very heavily indigenous. When I first saw it, I have to say that I was really wanting to have more whales in it. I wanted to have more dancing in it. I wanted to have more story singing in it. But the interesting thing about the film, in my opinion, is that it is so minimalist that anybody can walk into it, and you can be that daughter, you can be that grandmother, you can be that grandfather. So it was that minimalist aspect about the film that I think probably attributed to its success.
And I wonder what your thoughts are about the impact that your book and film have had on these discussions on Maori culture, on how much we can change, how much we should keep, and how this has developed over these past 30 plus years since the book was published.
So when I was of that age in the 1970s, when we were all really fighting for sovereignty, what we call tino rangatiratanga, there were so many gatekeepers, not only in the Pākehā world, but in the Māori world as well. But the demographics, Māori were beginning to go into cities and become urbanized and educated. And then with an educated majority, because we were such a young population, What then happened to our traditional ways of looking was that we gradually began to make out of those traditional ways modern art. We began to make out of that traditional singing modern singing. So the transition from a traditional into a contemporary force in terms of culture in New Zealand has now come to the point where you can't get away from Māori art. Nobody calls it traditional anymore because although it has come from a traditional source, it is no longer traditional, or it has taken the tradition into new forms. With literature, for instance, I always used to say that the novel was an alien construct for Māori and for Indigenous people. I always used to say that English was a profane language rather than Māori or Indigenous language. And now there were more Pākehā as well as, joining us, Māori, in learning the Māori reo. So it's kind of like now there are forces going that way and there are forces coming this way, and they are making of New Zealand an incredibly rich society where hopefully in the future we're going to be a new kind of people. We're going to be a new kind of civilization. We're certainly going to be a new kind of culture. In New Zealand, for instance, the Governor-General, in terms of representation, the Governor-General is a Māori and a woman. In our cabinet, our New Zealand cabinet, I think there are 15 Māori or other people of colour who are in the cabinet. There are 9 mayors of New Zealand who are Māori. So we are getting this hugely interesting, passionate country of people who are involved in talking to each other about the future, and I think that's doing away with that tradition, enabling women to have some governance, some representation in New Zealand, not just a presence, and that's why I think that in New Zealand we should be proud of what we're doing there. Yes. In terms of equality, equity, and justice.
Always more work to do, but yes, a lot
There's
of,
always
a
more
lot
work
of
to do,
progress
but
been
yes.
made.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. Yes.
I've been interested in how children are part of the writing process, even in some ways that we don't notice, we overlook. And so I was very interested in how you spoke about your daughters, and so I wanted to ask to what extent this book is directed at your daughters and written for your daughters, and whether I'm also wondering, speculating about whether that might be why it hits so powerfully with audiences, as does the film.
So I have a granddaughter now. Her name is Aria, and story has become something that everybody is writing in New Zealand. She goes to school, and there is one day of every school week in which all of the children write story. New Zealand too has decided that there will be a day of history, which is a holiday in which people reflect on the problems that we've had in the past. And then also try to just keep on talking about them. We have another holiday which has just been announced and also now has really become popular, which we call Matariki. And Matariki now signals that New Zealand has decided that its new year will not be in December, January, but it will be in June, July. So people are beginning to create stories of today for this new generation of the future. And those stories, one of these days I'm going to have to sit back and allow that modern generation to write those stories. And hopefully there will be new paikeas from a new generation continuing to perhaps ride spaceships into space.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your attendance, everybody.